Hello, everyone. I'm going to try to go over this quick so that I can get it out to you and um, so that you don't have to have a 30-minute presentation. So I'm just going to look at the beginnings of industrialization in the United States. This is content statement 8, but I'm not going to go over content statement 8 specifically. This is my own little design. So here's my goals. I want to examine pre-Civil War industrialization and then go to post-Civil War industrialization. And I want you to see the difference between them and also see how America is becoming more mechanized in labor and what that means and for people, but more importantly, or just as importantly, what it means for our economy. So let's get started. Now, notice I say pre-Civil War and post-Civil War. So just so you have like a reference of time, Civil War, of course, meaning this time period right here. So pre-Civil War would be this way. That would be the first half. Post-Civil War would be this way, second half. Okay, so let's keep. Come on. Can you get rid of that? Okay, well, my goodness. So I want you to try to anchor yourself back in the early 1800s. Most people are farmers. The vast majority of people are farmers. 80% of people are farmers. Most people live outside of a city. Most people live in a rural area or a very small town. Most people live in such a way that you either make and produce everything for yourself, or you make and produce things for yourself and for the local area, the local town around you. And that's it. But in the early 1800s, because of industrialization starting to take place in America and in Europe, there is a market revolution. Remember, revolution just means change. It does not mean revolution just means change. It does not mean war. It means change. So there's a change, and in this case, in a market. So what that means is people are now producing for a market, not just for themselves. They're producing for a wider audience, if you will, a wider area of people. Like your stuff that you produce on your farm in, say, Ohio, might be shipped all the way over to Europe, and you get money for it. So here's an example right here. Here's this local guy. He lives in some town. Let's just say it's in Massachusetts, right? And he's got a factory and he's got people working back here. Before the market revolution, his products would be bought and sold in his local city, town, whatever. The market revolution, though, gives us steamboats that can take those goods a long way away. And this actually kind of looks more like a passenger steamboat for luxury. No, that's not a steamboat. Wait, that's a factory. Ah, I looked at that too soon. Anyway, yeah, you can see the factory over there. And is that a steamboat? I don't know. What do you think? Is that a steamboat or is that a factory? A steamboat with a factory behind. Anyway, this is for certain. The railroads are going to be able to take his goods and ship them all across the country. And then maybe when it gets to a big city on the coast, it can go across the world. So market revolution, you're not just producing for you, you're producing for the world. Just some terms that you might come across in our discussion in class or just in life. An entrepreneur is a person who starts a business. So that very bottom term there, entrepreneur, is a person who starts a business, and this is the era of entrepreneurs, the 1800s. Of course, it still is, but this is when they really take off. Free enterprise and capitalism are kind of the same thing. We live in a country that has a profit motive. It's capitalism. Your reason to produce is so you can make money. Not everywhere in the world's like that. Socialism, communism are different. than that. They have different reasons for producing. Of course, they want to make money too, but capitalism is almost 100% driven purely by motive for profit. And in America, capitalism and free enterprise go hand in hand. And that means you have the ability as an entrepreneur to go out and do your business, create your business, sell for what you want to sell what you want to sell to who you want to sell, and make money for it. And there's not as many restrictions on that as there would be in, a country that has an absolute monarch or a communist dictator. And the economy is based around selling to the market. It's based around the laws of supply and demand. And you probably remember, do you remember this? As supply goes up, what happens to price? And then as supply goes down, what happens to the price of goods? If you remember those things, that is basically the law of supply and demand, which the market economy is based around. You produce for the market, and whether or not people want your stuff determines on how much money you get. So these are all things that go along with this era, and I'm not going to spend much more time on those. I might just use those terms later. So Britain really got to industrialization first. Their first mechanized industry, oops, their first mechanized industry was the textile industry. And you might remember the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny, nope. The spinning jenny would take thread that had been, cotton or wool that had been turned into threads, and then it would spin them around on little spools here so they could be used next for creating clothing. Putting on a sewing, something like a sewing machine, although there's not a sewing machine yet, and this is in the 1700s. The flying shuttle takes yarn, as you can see here, and it kind of puts it together into sheets of cloth, which you can see here being spooled down here, which can be used, of course, to make clothing. The earliest ways to power those things were by hand. So it was still industrial because it was machine driven, but you would have to use a pedal for your foot or your arms to pull things. But then people decided, especially in Britain, where there are some strong, fast flowing rivers, to use water to power those machines. And there would be conveyor belts inside that'd be, going around and around and powering those machines. Then, of course, James Watt, first Thomas Newcomen, and then James Watt invented the steam engine, which would, water would be heated over here, and the steam would help drive the pistons here, and that would turn the wheel, and you got machines powered by steam power. You can see the water going down and through there. Anyway, so when it gets to America, industry also is centered around textiles. And they're using some of these very same things. Now, Britain wanted to keep their competitive advantage, and so they said that no one was allowed to leave England with plans for factories, with designs for inventions. They wanted to keep their competitive advantage, to keep everyone else from having that information. Samuel Slater was an American. He goes to Britain, and he engages in what we call industrial espionage. He goes and spies on how the factories and the machines are set up. And he doesn't smuggle anything out as far as paper plans. He memorizes the plans for the factories, maybe for the machines too. You have to fact check me on that. But smuggles it out because he smuggles it in his brain. Like, he memorizes everything and brings it over to the United States. And what he does is he takes these new ideas of industrialization and production that he saw in Britain, and he combines them with traditional labor ideas. Basically, what that means here, and this picture doesn't show that very well. I just wanted to show you this phrase right here. What he does was he wanted to try to keep traditional gender norms by having women do the initial processing of clothing at home, the processing of the cotton or the wool at home, the spinning of it into yarns, but then have the men work in a factory. You can see here, factory, have the men work in a factory because it's okay for men to work outside the home in that era. I'm not saying that's the way it should be, that women stay home and men go out and work. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that he was trying to keep that old fashioned idea of women working inside domestically, men working outside the home. But what you see here is he's giving women a job in manufacturing. And so it's kind of a step forward, you could say, for women. You'll see more steps forward here in just a minute. With the Lowell Mills, the Lowell Mills took the next step and created the modern factory system by putting everything under one roof, or on, in this case, there was such a big operation in one complex. From start to finish, the production would be done. This is in Lowell, Massachusetts, named after a man named Henry Lowell. Now, you would think that because men are supposed to do the work outside the home at that time, that would mean the men are working in these factories, but you would be wrong. Lowell hired women who were, quote, economic liabilities to their parents, using phrases from that time. And what I mean by that is, or what they meant by that was, women who were not married, single ladies who had not been married yet. They were too old, per se, to stay at home. And so they were, 18. Back then, people married a little bit older, 20 years old. Or sorry, people married younger back then. So for the most part. So, they're 18, 19, 20, maybe 25. Um, it costs money for their parents to keep them. So why not send them? And, they would live in dormitories, right? They had strict curfews, etc. No male visitors allowed, as is proper. But they would get a paycheck, and they would work from start to finish on the textiles. Some of the first labor unions are the women working in the Lowell factories. Some of the first strikes by workers are women working in the Lowell mills. So there's another step forward, if you will, not to where we wanted to be yet, right? But we're getting there. Now, I've talked about this to most of my classes. I'm just going to reiterate this real quick. One of the reasons why there's so much cotton to be used in those factories was because of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which is short for cotton engine. What we have here is the difficulty of cotton to be processed because there's so many seeds in it. And it takes a long time to pick out those small little seeds. And sorry for yawning. It takes a long time. So Eli Whitney goes to a southern factory, and he's or a southern plantation, I should say, and the slavery was kind of a dying institution. It cost so much money to keep slaves, to feed them and house them and clothe them, pay for their medical treatment. And they weren't getting very much cotton produced because you couldn't produce much cotton because of how long it took to take the seeds out. And so Eli Whitney sees the difficulty of getting the seeds out. It takes him 10 days on a visit to a southern plantation. And Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. And you can see it's just a little like box like thing. You put the cotton in one side, and then you turn a crank, and the crank turns these brushes and these combs, and it combs out all of the cotton seeds, and you get clean cotton. And so, of course, after this, slavery becomes much more lucrative because you can have slaves producing, I don't know, 100 times more clean cotton in a day than you could before, right? And so slavery becomes more entrenched. This was in 1791. 1791. That was 1791. I wrote there. So that's a negative. A positive was it sends all this cotton up north so that they can use it, and there's money to be made, and women's roles expanding, etc. Of course, before the Civil War, we even get the first sewing machines. These were powered by foot. Maybe some of your grandparents might even have an old Singer sewing machine that looks something like this, and if they do, keep a hold of that because that's going to be a an antique that you can have as a family heirloom, right? And this helps we or sew clothing so much faster. And eventually, you get new women's fashion in the early 1900s. You get shirt waists. This is what they were called. And I'm mentioning the shirt waist first because women were the ones who were making these clothing in textile factories, but also we're going to see something that happens at a shirtwaist factory later on, probably in early November. So now, before the Civil War, it's not just textiles that's evolving and re-revolutionizing, but it's also transportation. The steam engine that had been used in textile factories in America is now put on a steam boat by Robert Fulton, the first steamboat invented by Robert Fulton. It was called the Claremont. You can see it down there in the bottom. And this is something what it would look like. There's a paddle wheel right here. And instead of humans using oars or the wind, you use steam. And eventually, you can use coal, which is why you can see here some more pollution coming out of there. The coal would heat the water, and the steam would power the paddle boat. It freed transportation from the tyranny of the weather, is what one person said. Now, travel on steamboats, of course, was by ocean, but also another transportation advancement was canals. You might remember from way back in maybe even elementary school, some of the first explorers of America were looking for the Northwest Passage. And you might remember the Northwest Passage was supposed to be this waterway that was supposed to go from this coast to this coast, and it would help us get to China because North America was in the way. Christopher Columbus was originally looking for China in India, right? There's no Northwest Passage, so let's make one. Let's make a system. Let's dig canals so that we can get all this agricultural goods from here and get it over here, right? And you can see there's a lot of canals in Ohio. Now you can see the Ohio Erie Canal, Ohio-Erie Canal, went from the Ohio River to Lake Erie, and you can see Circleville was on that stop. And in fact, this is a picture of an old Circleville Canal. And if you know where the canal park is, you might know one of the places, historical sites you can visit there. And even today, out Tarleton Road, close to Tarleton Road, hang a I can't remember if it's behind one of the factories, but there are remnants of these canals right here. The towed path would be right here where the horse would be drawing it. And there, and that's where the canal would go. Not used much anymore. The main canal in American history was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is in New York. It goes from Lake Erie to the Hudson River, and then, of course, on down to New York City. It looks something like this. New York State, Lake Erie. This is close to where Niagara Falls is. And then on down to New York City, down here. If you look at the map would show you that, the Mississippi River right here and the Missouri River and the Ohio River all empty out down here. And down here, you might know that this city is New Orleans. And New Orleans should have been the biggest city in the country because all of these farm goods would have been taken to these rivers and then gone out to New Orleans and then gone out. And there would have been the largest city in the country would have been a southern city. And the Erie Canal changed that. The Erie Canal took all of these agricultural goods and sent them this way to New York City. And New York City becomes the largest city in the country, a northern city. And the cost of transporting goods goes down so much because of these canals. Now, of course, there are also the first railroads and locomotives made. You can take a steam engine and you can put it on a little car looking thing here, and you can put it on rails and you can ship things back and forth. And, you know, the rails have the advantage of not freezing in wintertime like, a canal would. And so you can go through winter. And it took a while for people to really get the hang of or be interested in these railroads because, I mean, look at this thing. I mean, would you want this to be your transportation? This was nicknamed Tom Thumb, one of the first locomotives ever made. And they actually had a race between Tom Thumb and a horse, and the horse won. The locomotive, the train, the first train lost a race to a horse. Of course, there are improvements later on, and railroads become one of the biggest industry, and they overtake the canals by the time of the Civil War. But it was a little bit of a rough start. At first, the chickens wouldn't lay eggs going across the rails because it was so bumpy and shaky, and the sparks would fly up. And legend has it that these open carriages would catch women's dresses on fire because the sparks would fly up into the open carriages. So it was a rough beginning, but eventually it wins. So you can see here some of the earliest railroads. There's very few in slaveholding states, very few in northern states too. There's some here and so on. But then as time goes on, you get to 1840, a decade later. There's some in the South in slaveholding areas, but there's more that's developing up here in the North, the free states. And then by 1851, 10 years essentially before the Civil War, there's so many railroads here in the North. You can just see where industry is really starting to take root, and it's more in the North and not as much in the South. Also, and I think this is finally before no, there's two more things before the Civil War. There's a communication revolution, a revolution in communication. The Pony Express was one way to get letters from east to west quickly. And when I say quickly, I mean lots slower than we do today. You can see here, the Pony Express was meant to go from Missouri to California in 10 days or less. And what that basically meant was, they wanted young, skinny, wiry men that didn't weigh very much, or maybe boys, really, not over 18, willing to risk death daily because it's a dangerous place out west. Native Americans that were not happy with whites encroaching on their land, and just dangerous in general from wild animals and exhaustion. So they preferred orphans that didn't have any family connections, right? $25 per week would have been a good wage back then, a very good wage back then. And you would hop on a horse and you would basically ride it to exhaustion, and there would be another horse ready for you in the next town, and you would ride that horse to exhaustion, and you basically ride yourself to exhaustion, getting letters from place to place. That didn't last very long, really, because it started close to the time of the Civil War, and that's about the time the railroad started going out west. So, but it's a classic like adventure toughness kind of thing. Also, a change in communication was the telegraph. Someone is calling me right now, which is kind of ironic because the telegraph was the precursor to the telephone. So yeah, Samuel Morse invents this thing that you can string a wire up and you can use dashes and dots depending on how long you push down on this thing, and you translate that into a message, and the message is sent, almost instantaneously across from city to city. It's amazing. His first telegraph, he wrote on it, "What hath God wrought? What has God made?" Like this is so fantastic and so wow that it must be something that God inspired us to do, because Baltimore, 1,000 miles away from New York City, or Philadelphia or Boston, and you could send a message almost instantaneously. And we take that for granted today, but this was amazing back then. It got to the point that even, like, I think in the early 1900s, they put telegraph wires across the Atlantic Ocean. And you should definitely um, remember that for when we get to World War One. And you can see there was another one from France, and then there was one that kind of made pit stops here and there. Um, the American system basically took what each region was good at and said, let's focus on that, and then we can be reliant on ourselves, and we don't have to rely on foreign countries. Manufacturing up here, food over here, cotton, tobacco down here. Ship the cotton up here. It can be manufactured into clothing. Send the clothing here and here. Send the food here and here, and America can be reliant on itself. And that's pretty much what happened. I mean, pretty much it was predominantly manufacturing, predominantly or mostly cash crops like tobacco, and predominantly food. And you can see there's some, exceptions down here. But that's kind of what happened before the Civil War. And of course, talking about food, John Deere created his steel plow, which allowed tough Western soil, especially out this way, to be plowed easier, because steel is a stronger metal, which we'll talk more about later. Instead of threshing by hand with a scythe, this is a thresher made by Jerome Case. Is that right? No, this is the Reaper by Cyrus McCormick. The Reaper by Cyrus McCormick right here. And what the Reaper would do would cut off the stalks of the wheat or corn. You can see with these things, it would almost come like a scissor. Imagine these things going whoosh, whoosh, like a scissor, cutting it off, and you could get so much more reaped in a day. It wasn't even funny. And then they combine the Reaper with this. This is a thresher. What a thresher would do is take the stalks and separate the chaff from the wheat. So the stuff you don't use with the stuff you do use, the stuff for your horse and cow, and the stuff for your humans, right? And when you combine these two things, eventually you get a harvester, or what we would call a combine today. That doesn't come till later, but you can see before the Civil War, we have these things helping increase. So there's mechanization of production, increased production on the farm. Social changes you can see here. Population, the North had a greater population before industrialization really took hold. But then when industrialization takes hold, the Northern population explodes in the Southern population, because there's not as much industry, lags behind. Cities grow because of industrialization. And notice where the bigger cities are here. There's even a couple southern ones, right? But by 1860, because of industrialization, the northern areas grow so much, because with a population boom and urbanization, as opposed to the South, where there's not as much industrialization. I mean, just take a look at Chicago. It goes from, up, if you don't know where it is, it's up here. It goes from this small little backwater to 55,000 in 1854, and then after the Civil War, close to the turn of the century, it is a megalopolis. It's a metropolis, a huge one, and that's because of industry and urbanization. Now, this is more for after the Civil War, but you can see the results of urbanization. It is crowded, dirty, nasty, packed, disease spreads easily type of housing. You don't find this in rural places like you do in cities. And that will also come into play later when we get to how the other half lives. Manufacturing, of course, here is the root cause of most of this. You can see here before, um, as industrialization is taking hold, there's a greater concentration of manufacturing up here than in the South. But by the time we get closer to the Civil War, the manufacturing is here. You wonder why the North won the Civil War, and manufacturing is a big key to that. They could just produce more clothes, food, weapons. So the Civil War happens, and all of that's going on. You have the textiles, right, and the farming and so on. But after the Civil War, we shift into what we call heavy industry, and I think you'll see what I mean by heavy industry as we go through. But first, before we get to heavy industry, let's just round out a couple things here. Communication revolution. Christopher Sholes, after the Civil War, creates the first typewriter, and that improves what can be printed quickly. I think Mark Twain found out that he could type 57 words a minute instead of writing 5 words a minute, as it might seem sometimes when you're writing. And he is the first one, I think, to use a typewriter to write a novel. And it also, this typewriter gives women the opportunity to have an even greater job role in the economy, not just working in the textile mills, but now, let's be honest, stereotypically, they say that women are better at communication than men, and that stereotype was used in this role of being a secretary. I'm not saying that that's always necessarily true. I'm just saying that was the stereotype. And I'm not saying that being secretaries should be everyone's goal, but this did offer a new position, a new job for women that women could fill outside of being either at home or in a factory. Alexander Graham Bell invents the first telephone in 1876. This is, of course, after the Civil War, and it evolves into, wires with sound vibrations going back and forth. The sound vibrations being carried along wires, it evolves into something like this in the 1920s. The first message ever sent over the telephone was not something awesome like "What hath God wrought," like the telegraph had been. It was Alexander Graham Bell talking to his assistant. And I don't even know if he meant to have this be the first thing that he ever said across the telephone. But the first thing that was ever said across the telephone wire was, "Watson, come here, I need you." You may not know this, and maybe you do. If you've ever watched The Simpsons, Mr. Burns, the really, really old guy on the show, always answers the phone as saying "ahoy hoy" instead of "hello." Alexander Graham Bell wanted the standard to be, when you answer the phone, to say "ahoy." So there's a little tidbit. Another inventor in this time period was Thomas Edison. Here he is as a younger man. This is a phonograph, which was a sound recording device. Later on, he helps improve on a camera. And so Edison takes sound recording and camera and puts it together, and eventually will be one of the pioneers of helping people develop the first movie, the first motion picture. What's a movie except pictures going, really fast? He also creates the incandescent light bulb. Incandescent means, you might know from your vocab, it glows, it gives off light because it's heated. He tried like 5,000 different things to be the incandescent filament in a light bulb. And when he finally found the carbon filter there to be the filament, the carbon filament, not filter, he found it. And he didn't say that he was a failure. He said, "I found 5,000 different ways to not make a light bulb." Here he is as an older man. He was definitely a pioneer. There's no doubt. Here he is, I think, in his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which is across the way from New York City, across the Hudson River in New Jersey. He was also a cutthroat businessman too. He has an electric factory. He helps harness electricity. He has something called DC, or direct current. It was safer, but it wasn't very powerful. Along comes a guy named George Westinghouse, and here's George Westinghouse. And George Westinghouse hires a young person that used to work for Thomas Edison named Nikola Tesla. And Tesla's backstory is really cool. And if you ever get a chance to read about Nikola Tesla, he was into some crazy stuff. Like, I don't know, even maybe like time travel kind of stuff, theoretical time travel stuff, right? He creates something called alternating current. It's much more dangerous, but it is much more powerful. And there was a war between, Edison and his old protege Tesla, and Edison and Westinghouse over which would work. And there were contract bids and publicity wars and all that kind of stuff. And Westinghouse gets the 1896 Chicago World's Fair contract over Thomas Edison, and that's a huge deal. And Edison is ticked off, and like he wants to prove that alternating current is just absolutely too dangerous. And so when Thomas Edison stages an execution, there is somebody on death row, and he's going to be executed. And so instead of hanging him, Edison hooks up an electric chair, a chair that has electricity that will course through the person's body. And he wants to show people how dangerous alternating current is. And so he uses alternating current in that electric chair execution, and like thinking that it would make Tesla look bad. The dude that he electrocutes for the government lived through the first shock. And apparently one of the people there that saw it, right? Like the quote was almost like a prayer. They were like, "Great God, he's still alive." And it ended up making Edison look bad instead of Tesla and Westinghouse, right? And really, in the end, in the long run, Tesla and Westinghouse win the war because AC is more what we use today. And of course, we all lose because later on, an Australian band with long hair in the 70s named themselves AC/DC. Yuck. You can ask me why I don't like AC/DC later. Getting into heavy industry. After the Civil War, we get heavy industry, and steel is one of those. Iron is only so strong. It's strong, but it's only so strong. And it puts out this. When you make iron, when you smelt iron, it makes a strong metal, but it still has impurities in it. So it has to be replaced a lot over time. So, for example, like the railroads, the iron had to be replaced a lot on the railroad ties had to be replaced a lot because they would break down with all that heavy traffic going over top of it. The buildings couldn't be built as tall as maybe you would want. Maybe 10 stories max with iron, because iron just wasn't, it was strong, but not as strong. And so this guy in England named Henry Bessemer comes up with this process that is called the Bessemer process. And then it's copied in America later. I don't know who stole those plans, but you take molten liquid iron and you pour it into this big smelting machine. And then you can see here, there's a little air circulator that blows hot air into it. And that actually helps purify the iron into a much stronger metal. And you can see down here, it's poured into this, and then they pour that the new steel into these molds, etc. You can see these huge furnaces. The carbon monoxide, of course, is sent out, so there's a lot of pollution because of that. But you take this stuff, you take this hot air and you blow it in, and the iron becomes steel. Pretty cool. Andrew Carnegie really takes that and mass produces with the Bessemer process and becomes the steel guy. before 1900. Edwin Drake takes that idea of a steam engine and he uses it to drill downwards. And what he's looking for is oil. He's looking for petroleum. Back then, there was no cars, so he wasn't looking for oil to use for cars. He was looking for oil to use for lighting and heating. You process petroleum and you can get stuff like kerosene, which will light and heat your home. You can also use some of the byproduct of it and create things like petroleum jelly or Vaseline, which was used as hair care and skin care and all that stuff back then. And so Edwin Drake uses a steam engine. He creates this little silo here. It kind of might remind you of some of those oil rigs out west that are not closed in like this. And he drills down and he caps it and he drills for oil. And the rest is history. John D. Rockefeller became one of the richest people ever because he perfected the processing of petroleum into kerosene. And his Standard Oil Company made him, at the time, the richest man in the world. And there you can see him as an older man. He was also a cutthroat businessman, as you'll find out. More heavy industry. Railroads start to come into their own. Here is a painting of the Transcontinental Railroad. And you can see here the first Transcontinental Railroad goes from New York to Chicago, and then it kind of stopped out here. During the Civil War, President Lincoln signed a law that said, let's finish it. And so it goes all the way out here. This is the Union Pacific. And then at the same time, the Central Pacific started going this way, and they met here, Promontory Point, Utah. And they drove legend has it, a golden spike to mark the meeting of these two, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to make the Transcontinental Railroad. And you can see I misspelled it right there, but oh well. I think later they took the golden spike out so that, and kept it so nobody could steal it, right? Obviously, you can see that this has big implications for trade, because you can take goods across the country, and then there were other transcontinental railroads that were made later. But also the implications are this is going to bring more whites into Native American territory, and we'll learn more later about the Native American Wars. Because of the transcontinental nature of railroads now going across the country, the time in New York City is not the same time as in San Francisco, right? And so the railroads invent time zones. And we get the first time zones in American history because of the railroads. Not quite the same as they are today. We are in Eastern Standard Time now, whereas it wasn't that way before. But we get time zones because of that. And that helps keep orders online, on time, on target. Cornelius Vanderbilt was nicknamed the Commodore, first because Commodore is a title for people in the Navy. And what he does is creates a shipping empire that goes from before the Transcontinental Railroad, that goes all the way from New York City around the tip of South America and over to California during the gold rush. Then he decides he's going to get into railroads. And he is also a cutthroat businessman. You can see he makes a ton of money on railroads. And this picture called him the Colossus, right? And there were two other men, Cyrus Field and Jay Gould, who were also very rich men who were also in railroads. But Cornelius Vanderbilt owned the New York Central Railroad, and it was a huge thing. And he was even bigger than these guys. Before Rockefeller came along, Vanderbilt was the richest guy. He was the Commodore. Vanderbilt University named after him. Didn't give to charity much because he figured people should work hard like he did. This guy did give a lot to charity. He ended up giving 90% of his wealth away because he believed that the rich people should. Take that off there. It looks like he's I'm targeting him for assassination. I don't mean that. Andrew Carnegie, Scottish immigrant, came to America, rags to riches story, had an eighth grade education, became one of the richest men in the world. He got into railroads, he got into telegraphs, he got into steel was his big thing. His Carnegie steel was monumental, and he eventually sold his Carnegie steel to another guy for $500 million, which at the time, gave him so much money it wasn't even funny. He basically retired early and started giving his money away because he believed that rich people are rich because of society buying their stuff, and they should give back. And so he gave back by giving a lot of money to charity, especially establishing Carnegie libraries all across the country. Give kids the chance, like I did, to educate myself and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, and you'll have it. They can do what I did. He wrote a book called The Gospel of Wealth, where he tried to get other rich men to do what he did. J.P. Morgan was the guy who bought Carnegie Steel. J.P. Morgan owned U.S. Steel. J.P. Morgan eventually bought Vanderbilt's New York Central. J.P. Morgan was big into banking. So big into banking that his firm helped bail out America from the 1873 panic, the 1893 panic, this 1907 panic. And even after he died, his company, his banking company, tried to help bail out Wall Street after the great stock market crash of 1929. Cutthroat businessman. And you can kind of see his personality. I mean, look at this. Look at this picture. Like, people said that meeting him was like looking into the headlights of an oncoming train. I mean, those eyes pierce your soul, and you don't mess with JP Morgan. 1905. It was a question as to whether or not the president of the United States, who was Teddy Roosevelt, was the most powerful man in the country, or was it JP Morgan, who was the most powerful man in the country? George Pullman is another railroad guy, but he didn't get money from shipping. He got money, goods. He got money for making luxury passenger cars. His company, the Pullman Sleeping Palace Car Company, allowed you to travel in style. It was basically the first class on something besides a boat. He also came up with a company town. Pullman, Illinois, was the name of a town that he built basically around his factory. And the company town was ingenious, really. He built the town to be safer and have less crime and to be clean. And his workers would be the ones who would live in the town, right? So they would pay him rent. He would pay them their paycheck, but they would pay the money back in rent. And there was a company store in the town where you would buy all of if you're a worker, you'd buy all your groceries and goods that you needed. And guess who owned the company town? The company store was owned by Pullman. So basically, all the wages he pays out, kind of most of them come back to him from his workers. You might remember a old Tennessee was it Tennessee Williams, Tennessee Ernie Ford? Anyway, the old country singer who sang 16 Tons and What Do You Get? Another Day Older and Deeper in Debt. Part of that song was he owed his soul to the company store. So you might remember that. That's it. That was way longer than I thought I would take, and I apologize for how long it took.